The crystal chandeliers of the Hotel d'Angleterre cast a golden, deceptive glow over the diplomatic elite of Geneva. Arthur Beaumont stood by the tall, frost-kissed windows, swirling a glass of dry champagne, watching his wife, Karina, effortlessly translate a complex geopolitical joke for the French Minister of Defense. She was a vision of loyalty and grace, the perfect diplomat's wife, her laughter a melodic chime that commanded the room. Then, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom opened, and Sidonie, the lead event coordinator, approached Arthur with trembling hands. She bypassed protocol, slipping a red classified folder directly into his palm, her voice a terrified whisper. "Sir, a secure diplomatic cable was misrouted to the public translation server. It is not about the summit." Arthur opened the folder, expecting state secrets. Instead, he found a detailed itinerary, an offshore bank routing number, and a message from Karina to an unknown man, detailing exactly how she planned to drain Arthur's accounts and vanish before Sunday. If stories of chilling betrayals, calculated revenge, and the dark psychological games played behind closed doors speak to you, stay with me. Underscore. The chill of the Geneva evening was entirely different from the synthetic cold inside the Paletta Nations. Outside, the wind whipped off the black surface of Lake Geneva, carrying the promise of a harsh Swiss winter. Inside the grand ballroom of the Hotel d'Angleterre, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, roasting meats, and the intoxicating electricity of international power. Arthur Beaumont stood near the edge of the room, a glass of vintage champagne warming in his grip. As a senior diplomat, his job was to observe the invisible currents of influence flowing through the room. Tonight, however, his focus was fixed entirely on his wife. Karina stood beneath a massive crystal chandelier, a vision wrapped in emerald silk. She was speaking in rapid, flawless French to a circle of European ministers. As an elite translator, she did not merely convert words. She conveyed nuances, disarmed egos, and bridged impossible cultural divides. She laughed at something the French defense minister said, tilting her head back, exposing the elegant line of her throat. Arthur felt a familiar surge of pride. They were the formidable Beaumonts, an impenetrable American fortress in the heart of Europe. "Mr. Beaumont." The voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the orchestral music and the low hum of hundreds of conversations. Arthur turned to see Sidonie, the lead event coordinator for the summit. Normally, Sidonie was a model of Swiss efficiency, composed, invisible, and strictly professional. Tonight, her face was drained of color, her eyes darting nervously toward the security detail near the exits. "Sidonie," Arthur said, his diplomatic smile slipping effortlessly into place. "Is there an issue with the seating arrangement for the Prime Minister?" "No, sir." She stepped closer, invading his personal space in a way that violated every rule of summit etiquette. Her hands were trembling. She pressed a thick, red folder against his chest, forcing him to take it. A secure cable came through. It was encrypted, but a routing error on the temporary server bypassed the security filters. It printed directly to my station in the coordination room. Arthur frowned, the champagne glass suddenly heavy in his other hand. A leaked diplomatic cable was a catastrophe. "Has anyone else seen this?" "No," Sidonie whispered, her voice cracking. "I grabbed it immediately. But Mr. Beaumont, it is not a state secret. It is personal. From your wife's secure tablet." Arthur's heart performed a strange, hollow beat. He looked at the folder, stamped with the unmistakable seal of the secure network, and then looked back across the room. Karina was still smiling, now accepting a fresh drink from a waiter. She looked utterly serene. "Thank you, Sidonie," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a calm, authoritative register. "Return to your post. Speak of this to no one." Sidonie nodded quickly and practically fled into the crowd. Arthur did not open the folder immediately. He walked methodically toward a quiet alcove near the terrace doors, hidden by heavy velvet drapery. He set his champagne down on a marble table. The air around him suddenly felt suffocatingly thin. With a steady hand, he broke the seal and opened the file. It was a transcript of an intercepted digital communication sent from Karina's private IP address to an untraceable offshore server. The transfer is scheduled for Friday at 1600 hours. By the time Arthur realizes the joint accounts are empty, we will be in the air. I have the keys to the flat in Monaco. Just be at the airstrip, Julian. I cannot spend one more night pretending to love this man. Arthur read the words 3 times. The letters seemed to detach themselves from the page, floating in his vision like jagged pieces of glass. Drain the accounts. The flat in Monaco. Julian. Pretending to love this man. He looked up from the page. Across the vast expanse of the ballroom, Karina caught his eye. She offered him a soft, intimate smile, the kind of smile they reserved only for each other, a secret communication between husband and wife amidst the chaos of the world. Arthur stared at her. The woman he had loved for 7 years, the woman he had built an empire with, was currently executing a meticulous plan to ruin him. A sudden, violent roar of anger threatened to tear its way out of his throat, but decades of diplomatic training clamped down on it like a steel vice. He did not shatter his glass. He did not storm across the room and scream. Instead, a terrifying, absolute cold washed over him, settling deep into his bones. He smiled back at her, raising his empty hand in a silent toast. If she wanted to play a game of shadows and deception, she had chosen the wrong opponent. The divorce was going to cost her everything. The ride back to their penthouse in the back of the armored diplomatic Mercedes was a masterclass in psychological endurance. Geneva drifted past the tinted windows, a blur of dark water and glittering streetlights, while the heavy silence of the car felt like a physical weight pressing against Arthur's chest. The soundproof partition separating them from the driver ensured absolute privacy, a luxury that now felt like a suffocating trap. Karina sighed, a soft, exhausted sound that Arthur had found endearing for the last 7 years. She slipped off her emerald heels, tucking her feet beneath her on the leather seat, and leaned her head against the window. The French minister was absolutely insufferable tonight, she murmured, her eyes half closed. I had to soften his rhetoric on the trade tariffs 3 times before the German delegation realized he was insulting them. I am entirely drained. Arthur looked at her. He studied the slope of her nose, the relaxed curve of her mouth, the subtle scent of jasmine that always seemed to linger in her hair. It was a terrifying realization to look at the person you loved most in the world and see a complete stranger. She was perfectly composed, casually complaining about international trade while actively orchestrating his financial and emotional ruin. The sheer audacity of her deceit was almost impressive. You handled him brilliantly, as always, Arthur said. His voice was remarkably steady, pitched in the exact, soothing baritone he used to de-escalate hostage negotiations early in his career. The summit would fall apart without you navigating the egos. Karina turned her head, offering him a warm, appreciative smile. She reached across the console, her cool fingers lightly brushing the back of his hand. Thank you, darling. Are you all right? You seem a bit distant since the reception. A lesser man would have snapped. A lesser man would have pulled the intercepted cable from his breast pocket, thrown it in her face, and demanded answers. He would have screamed, demanded to know who Julian was, and asked why 7 years of marriage were being discarded for an offshore account and a flat in Monaco. But Arthur Beaumont was not a lesser man. He was a senior diplomat of the United States. He dealt with hostile regimes, rogue states, and enemies who smiled while sliding a knife into your ribs. He knew that information was only valuable if the enemy did not know you possessed it. Confronting her now would be a tactical disaster. It would give her the opportunity to pivot, to play the victim, or worse, to alert Julian and expedite the transfer of funds. Instead, Arthur turned his hand over and gently squeezed her fingers. The physical contact made his skin crawl, but his face betrayed nothing. Just a minor headache. Arthur lied seamlessly, holding her gaze in the dim light of the cabin. A misrouted communication from Washington regarding the Baltic agreements. Nothing I cannot handle in the morning. You work too hard, she whispered, squeezing his hand back before withdrawing to her side of the car. We need a vacation when this summit is over. Somewhere quiet. Yes, Arthur agreed, his eyes returning to the dark waters of Lake Geneva outside his window. Somewhere very quiet. Just the two of us. As the Mercedes pulled into the underground garage of their building, Arthur's mind was already compartmentalizing the trauma. The grief was pushed into a dark, locked vault in the back of his mind, replaced entirely by cold, algorithmic logic. Karina was no longer his wife. She was a hostile entity attempting to exfiltrate critical assets. He had until Friday at 1600 hours to dismantle her infrastructure, identify her co-conspirator, and lock the blast doors before she even realized she was under siege. The Cold War had officially begun in the Beaumont household, and Arthur intended to ensure mutually assured destruction was not an option. He was going to win. The Paletta Nations was a monument to order, an architectural manifestation of international control. At 7 in the morning, the vast limestone corridors were practically deserted, echoing only with the sharp, rhythmic cadence of Arthur's leather Oxfords. He had not slept. Instead, he had spent the dark hours of the night staring at the ceiling of their penthouse, listening to the soft, even breathing of the woman lying next to him, the woman actively plotting his absolute destruction. He swiped his high-level security badge at the entrance of Briefing Room 4, a windowless, soundproof chamber typically reserved for discussing classified trade embargoes and intelligence sharing. 5 minutes later, Sydney arrived. The lead event coordinator looked as though she had slept even less than Arthur. Her usually immaculate bun was slightly frayed, and the dark circles under her eyes betrayed a deep, institutional panic. Sit, please, Arthur commanded softly, gesturing to the heavy oak table. He did not sit. He remained standing, looming slightly, letting the silence stretch until the air in the room felt heavy and suffocating. Sydney gripped the edge of the table. Mr. Beaumont, I want to assure you, regarding last night, I am not interested in assurances, Sydney. I am interested in protocol, Arthur interrupted, his voice smooth and devoid of any emotional inflection. He placed a blank, gray folder on the table between them. The communication you intercepted was not a personal lapse. It was an unauthorized transmission from a compromised device on a secure network. Do you understand what that means? Sydney swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the gray folder. I assumed it was private. From your wife. You assumed incorrectly. Arthur lied, his face an impenetrable mask of bureaucratic authority. He was weaponizing the very establishment he served to protect his wounded pride and conceal his domestic failure. You intercepted a breach of security protocols that falls under the jurisdiction of the Diplomatic Intelligence Directorate. If it is known that a public coordination server acted as a conduit for an encrypted transmission, there will be a full-scale multinational audit. Your team, your servers, your personal devices, and your career will be subjected to an invasive federal investigation. The color drained entirely from Sydney's face. In the hierarchy of Geneva, high-level event coordinators survived entirely on their reputation for discretion and reliability. An international intelligence audit would permanently blacklist her across Europe. What do you need me to do? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Arthur leaned forward, resting his palms flat on the cold wood of the table. You will purge the temporary server logs from yesterday evening. Every line of code, every temporary cache, every printed history that shows that file touched your station. You will run a military-grade overwrite on the hard drive. If anyone asks why, you will state there was a routine memory wipe due to the massive volume of summit data. And the printout, she asked, her hands shaking slightly in her lap. It has been securely incinerated, Arthur replied without blinking. The red folder was, in fact, locked inside his personal biometric safe in his office down the hall. When you leave this room, the event of last night will cease to exist in your memory. If a whisper of this reaches my wife, or anyone else in the delegation, I will not protect you from the resulting audit. Am I understood? Completely, sir, Sydney breathed, nodding rapidly. The logs will be wiped within the hour. No one will ever know. Excellent. Arthur said, finally offering a brief, chillingly polite smile. Thank you for your service to the summit, Sydney. You may go. He watched her practically flee the soundproof room. As the heavy steel-reinforced door clicked shut, locking him in the artificial silence, Arthur allowed his shoulders to drop a fraction of an inch. His perimeter was secure. The leak was plugged. Now, he had the space and the silence required to follow the money. The biometric lock of Arthur's private office safe chimed softly, a precise, electronic sound in the otherwise silent room. He withdrew the red folder, laying the single sheet of intercepted communication flat on his mahogany desk. The morning sunlight of Geneva streamed through the reinforced glass, illuminating the cold, hard data of his wife's treachery. The transfer is scheduled for Friday at 1600 hours. Arthur booted up his secured terminal, entirely bypassing the standard diplomatic intranet. He accessed a proprietary financial tracking interface, a tool typically reserved for monitoring international money laundering and the illicit funding of hostile regimes. Today, he was deploying the full weight of the American intelligence apparatus against his own checking account. He typed in the routing numbers listed in Karina's message to Julian. The cursor blinked rhythmically, a steady pulse against the stark black screen. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating for a fraction of a second. This was the point of no return. Once he saw the architecture of her betrayal, he could never unsee it. He pressed enter. The screen flooded with data, a cascading waterfall of green text detailing the financial anatomy of their marriage. Arthur leaned closer, his eyes scanning the complex web of transactions. What he found was not a sudden, impulsive theft, but a masterstroke of long-term, calculated embezzlement. For the past 14 months, Karina had been systematically bleeding their joint investment portfolios dry. She had not made large, suspicious withdrawals. Instead, she had utilized her power of attorney, which Arthur had willingly granted her years ago out of absolute trust, to execute hundreds of microtransfers. She had liquidated stocks in fractional amounts, diverted dividends from his inherited trust, and skimmed the top of their high-yield savings accounts. Arthur's chest tightened as he followed the digital breadcrumbs. The funds had not gone directly to the offshore account mentioned in the cable. Karina was too intelligent for that. The money had been laundered through a labyrinth of shell corporations registered in Luxembourg and the Cayman Islands, entities designed for the sole purpose of obscuring the origin of the capital. The final destination was a numbered, anonymous account at a private bank in Zurich, heavily fortified by Swiss banking secrecy laws. The balance resting in that dark vault was staggering. It represented nearly 70% of Arthur's liquid assets, a lifetime of careful accumulation and inherited wealth. It was everything he had built for their future, now weaponized to fund her escape. He rubbed his temples, a dull, throbbing pain settling behind his eyes. The meticulous nature of the theft was more devastating than the infidelity itself. Karina had sat across from him at dinner parties, smiled at him across the breakfast table, and slept in his arms, all while silently, daily, robbing him blind. Every "I love you," every shared laugh, had been underwritten by a silent, ongoing transaction. A soft knock on the office door startled him. "Arthur," Karina's voice floated through the heavy oak. "Are you decent? I brought you an espresso before my morning briefing." Arthur stared at the screen, the undeniable proof of his impending ruin glaring back at him. He closed the tracking interface, minimizing the window with a swift keystroke, and smoothed his tie. The mask slid back into place, cold and perfect. "Come in, darling," he called out, his voice smooth and welcoming. The door opened, and Karina stepped in, holding a small porcelain cup. She looked radiant, her hair perfectly styled, wearing a tailored navy suit that screamed competence and loyalty. She smiled, entirely unaware that the man sitting behind the desk was currently dissecting the corpse of their marriage. Arthur accepted the espresso, his fingers brushing hers, and smiled back, the Cold War escalating in the silence between them. The espresso Karina had brought him tasted like ash, but Arthur drank it methodically, savoring the bitter reality of his situation. He watched her leave his office, her confident stride echoing down the corridor. Once the door clicked shut, he reopened his secure terminal. He had the financial architecture of her escape. Now, he needed the face of the architect she was building it with. Julian. The name in the intercepted cable was maddeningly common in the European diplomatic circuit. However, Arthur Beaumont did not reach the upper echelons of international negotiation by relying on guesswork. He accessed the summit's master personnel database, a restricted registry of every delegate, staff member, and intelligence officer currently cleared for the Paletta Nations. He applied a series of filters. Julian. Male. Currently stationed in Geneva or holding a multi-entry visa for Switzerland. Connected, however tangentially, to the translation services or the French delegation Karina frequently interacted with. The search returned 42 results. Arthur's eyes scanned the list, his mind working like a cold, calculating machine. He cross-referenced the names against the timeline of Karina's financial diversions, which had begun 14 months ago. He looked for arrivals, new postings, and sudden shifts in diplomatic assignments that coincided with that date. The list narrowed to 12, then to 5. He opened the personnel file of Julian Vane, a British cultural attaché assigned to the UN European headquarters 13 months prior. The photograph on the screen was of a man 10 years younger than Arthur. Vane possessed the rugged, slightly disheveled charm of a man who spent his time curating art exhibitions rather than negotiating nuclear treaties. His dossier noted a fluency in French, a penchant for high-stakes poker, and a modest government salary that entirely contradicted the lifestyle required to maintain a flat in Monaco. Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, the leather creaking softly in the quiet room. He pulled up Vane's security log. The man had swiped into the secure translation wing of the Paletta Nations, an area where he had no official business, 17 times in the past month. The times consistently aligned with Karina's late-night drafting sessions for the summit communiques. The pieces of the puzzle snapped together with an audible, sickening click. It wasn't a sudden, passionate affair ignited by the stress of the summit. It was a prolonged, systemic betrayal. Vane was not merely a lover. He was an accomplice, providing the European connections and the logistical framework for Karina's extraction plan. A sharp knock on the door pulled Arthur from his dark reverie. It was his chief of staff, Marcus. "Sir," Marcus said, stepping into the room with a stack of briefing folders. "The bilateral talks with the German delegation begin in 20 minutes. Mrs. Beaumont is already in the translation booth, prepping the initial statements." Arthur stared at the screen for a fraction of a second longer, burning the image of Julian Vane's face into his memory before closing the file. The sheer audacity of it all, Karina translating state secrets while simultaneously plotting her own clandestine exit strategy, was almost poetic in its cruelty. "Thank you, Marcus," Arthur said, his voice a smooth, professional baritone. He stood, adjusting his cuffs with practiced precision. "Have the Intelligence Directorate pull the full travel history for Julian Vane, British cultural attaché. Flag it as a routine background check for a potential cultural exchange initiative. Keep it entirely off the main ledger." Marcus frowned slightly, but nodded. "Consider it done, sir. Is there a concern regarding Mr. Vane?" "Just a minor curiosity," Arthur lied, sliding the red folder of intercepted communications back into his biometric safe. The lock engaged with a solid, definitive thud. "I always like to know exactly who I am dealing with before a negotiation." He grabbed his suit jacket and walked out of the office, his posture impeccably straight. The grief was gone, replaced by the icy clarity of an impending strike. Julian Vane and Karina Beaumont believed they were playing a romantic tragedy. Arthur was about to teach them the brutal realities of geopolitical warfare. The summit hummed with the superficial tension of 1,000 minor disagreements. Arthur Beaumont sat at the long, polished mahogany table of Committee Room 8, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and the quiet rustle of translated documents. Across the room, separated by a pane of soundproof glass, Karina sat in the translation booth. She wore her headphones like a crown, her lips moving in perfect sync with the German Chancellor's speech, translating the nuances of grain subsidies into flawless English. Arthur watched her, his expression a mask of polite interest. Beneath the surface, his mind was operating on a completely different frequency. He had 3 days until Friday at 1600 hours. He had the routing numbers, he had the destination, and he had the identity of the accomplice. Now, it was time to build the wall. During a scheduled recess, Arthur slipped away from the American delegation and retreated to a secure communications terminal deep within the Poleta Nations, a room heavily shielded against electronic surveillance. He bypassed the standard State Department networks, accessing a deeply buried, classified protocol designed for tracing the illicit funding of terrorist organizations. It was a sledgehammer of a tool, but Arthur required absolute certainty. He pulled up the complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts Karina had painstakingly constructed over the past 14 months. The money was currently resting in a transitional holding account in Luxembourg, waiting for the final authorization code to transfer to the private bank in Zurich. Arthur's fingers hovered over the keyboard. He could simply freeze the assets now, claiming identity theft or fraud. However, doing so would trigger an immediate notification to Karina's secure tablet. She would know the game was up, and she would run, taking whatever liquid assets she still had access to and disappearing with Julian Vane before the dust settled. That was an unacceptable outcome. Arthur did not merely want to protect his wealth. He wanted to witness her complete, crushing defeat. He initiated a shadow protocol, a complex algorithm that essentially cloned the routing architecture of the Luxembourg account. He did not freeze the funds. He redirected their final destination. Instead of the anonymous Swiss vault, he created a mirrored digital pathway that led directly into an irrevocable trust controlled entirely by the Beaumont family estate, an entity that required Arthur's biometric signature and a physical key to access, even for Karina. He worked methodically, writing the code to remain dormant. The system would register the transaction as successful on Karina's end. Her tablet would display a confirmation receipt at 1600 hours on Friday. But the money would never reach Zurich. It would plunge into a black hole of legal bureaucracy, instantly locking her out of every cent she had stolen. The final piece of the trap required physical insurance. Arthur opened a secondary window, accessing the secure messaging system of the Swiss bank where the final account was held. He drafted a formal, heavily encrypted legal notice, invoking a little-known clause in Swiss banking law regarding the suspected fraudulent transfer of marital assets by a foreign diplomat. Account hashtag 847B, Zurich. Flag for immediate custodial hold upon receipt of incoming transfer at 1600 hours, Friday. Do not notify the account holder. Await diplomatic clearance from the U.S. Embassy. He hit send, watching the confirmation bar load with agonizing slowness. The trap was set. The door of the cage was wide open, and the bait was perfectly arranged. Arthur logged out of the terminal, wiping the session data with a practiced series of keystrokes. He straightened his tie in the reflection of the black monitor. He had just secured his empire and signed his wife's financial death warrant. He walked back into the bright, chaotic energy of the summit, slipping seamlessly back into the role of the devoted husband. As he approached the translation booth, Karina stepped out, rubbing her eyes with a weary sigh. She smiled when she saw him, a perfect picture of marital exhaustion. God, the Germans are relentless today, she murmured, leaning into him slightly. Arthur placed a comforting hand on the small of her back, the fabric of her silk blouse smooth beneath his palm. You were magnificent, darling. Just a few more days, and then we can finally rest. Yes, she agreed softly, her eyes entirely devoid of guilt. A few more days. The penthouse was ablaze with the soft, amber glow of recessed lighting and the low hum of cultured conversation. Thursday evening, the night before Karina's meticulously planned extraction, Arthur insisted on hosting an intimate dinner for a select group of diplomats. The guest list was carefully curated: the French defense minister, a prominent Swiss banker, and crucially, Julian Vane's direct superior, the British ambassador to the UN. Karina moved through the expansive living room with the fluid grace of a woman who believed she had already won. She poured a full-bodied Bordeaux, her laughter light and unburdened as she navigated the complex web of international small talk. She was wearing a stunning, backless gown that Arthur had bought her in Paris 3 years ago, a deliberate choice, he noted coldly, to play the role of the perfect wife one last time. Arthur stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Geneva, watching her with the detached fascination of a predator observing its prey. The trap was set for tomorrow at 1600 hours, but tonight, he intended to test the structural integrity of her lies. As the guests migrated toward the long dining table, Arthur took his seat at the head, gesturing for Karina to sit opposite him. The conversation naturally gravitated toward the logistical nightmare of the summit's impending conclusion. It is always the extraction that is the most difficult part of any operation, Arthur remarked smoothly, his voice cutting through the clatter of silverware. He picked up his wine glass, swirling the dark liquid, his eyes fixed entirely on Karina. The planning is simple. It is the execution, the moment you actually try to leave the established perimeter, that requires absolute precision. The French minister chuckled, oblivious to the subtext. Indeed, Arthur, getting 300 delegates out of Geneva without a diplomatic incident is a tactical nightmare. Karina smiled politely, but Arthur noticed a microscopic tightening around her eyes. She took a slow sip of her wine. I suppose that is why we rely on meticulous itineraries, darling, she said, her voice perfectly level. Everyone needs to know exactly where they are going. Precisely, Arthur agreed, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. But one must always account for unforeseen variables. A misrouted communication, for instance. A sudden freeze in assets. The sudden disappearance of a key ally. He let the word hang in the air for a fraction of a second longer than was socially acceptable. He watched Karina's hand falter slightly as she reached for her water glass. The movement was almost imperceptible, but to Arthur, who had spent 7 years memorizing her body language, it was a deafening scream of panic. The British ambassador, a stout man with a booming laugh, leaned forward. Speaking of allies, Arthur, I must apologize for the absence of my cultural attaché, Julian Vane. He was meant to join us tonight, but he sent his regrets. A sudden, rather severe case of food poisoning, I believe. Karina's gaze snapped toward the ambassador, the polite mask slipping for a terrifying, singular moment before she forcibly reconstructed it. The color drained slightly from her cheeks. Arthur's smile widened, a cold, predatory curve. He had not poisoned Julian Vane, but he had spent the afternoon ensuring the man was entirely occupied with a sudden, highly aggressive audit of his department's discretionary funds, an audit Arthur had anonymously triggered through the UN Ethics Committee. What a shame, Arthur said softly, his eyes returning to his wife. She looked back at him, a sudden, horrifying realization dawning in the depths of her irises. She was beginning to understand that the ground beneath her feet was not solid, but she could not yet grasp the magnitude of the earthquake. I hope Julian recovers swiftly. It would be a tragedy if his sudden illness complicated his travel plans for the weekend. He watched Karina swallow hard, her throat working against the sudden dryness of fear. The dinner party continued around them, a symphony of oblivious diplomacy, while a silent, brutal war raged across the expanse of the mahogany table. Arthur raised his glass to her, the crystal catching the amber light. To a flawless execution tomorrow, darling, he toasted, his voice a silken threat. Karina raised her glass in return, her hand trembling so violently that the wine nearly spilled over the rim. The basement parking garage of the Paletta Nations was a concrete cavern of echoes, permanently illuminated by harsh fluorescent strips that hummed with a low, oppressive frequency. It was 6 a.m. on Friday. 10 hours before Karina's final transfer, Arthur Beaumont stood beside his black Mercedes, the collar of his overcoat turned up against the subterranean chill, waiting for Julian Vane. The sudden, aggressive audit of the British cultural attaché's discretionary funds had worked precisely as intended. Vane was forced to arrive hours before the summit resumed, desperately attempting to reconcile missing receipts before the UN Ethics Committee officially suspended his clearance. Arthur watched as a modest sedan pulled into a spot 3 rows away. Julian Vane stepped out, looking significantly worse than his personnel file photograph. He was pale, his tie askew, and he moved with the frantic, jagged energy of a man whose life was rapidly unspooling. "Mr. Vane," Arthur called out, his voice a calm, authoritative boom that echoed off the concrete pillars. Julian froze, turning slowly. When he recognized the senior American diplomat, a flash of pure, primal terror crossed his features before he managed to construct a flimsy mask of professional courtesy. "Mr. Beaumont." "Sir, you are here early." Arthur closed the distance between them, his steps measured and deliberate. He did not extend his hand. He simply stopped a foot away from the younger man, using his physical presence and the institutional weight of his position to immediately assert dominance. "I imagine we are both early for the same reason, Julian," Arthur said softly, almost conversationally. "The sudden complications regarding your travel plans for the weekend." Julian swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the exits. I do not understand, sir. My travel plans?" "The flat in Monaco. The Friday afternoon departure," Arthur clarified, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly level tone. He reached into his overcoat and produced a slim, manila envelope, offering it to the British attaché. "I believe you are currently experiencing a severe professional crisis, Julian. An audit of your department's funds. A potential suspension of your diplomatic immunity." Julian did not take the envelope. He stared at it, as if it were a live explosive. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Beaumont. The audit is a misunderstanding." "It is not a misunderstanding. It is a demonstration," Arthur corrected him coldly. He opened the envelope himself, revealing a single sheet of paper with a UN seal. "I am the one who initiated the audit, Julian. Just as I am the one who intercepted my wife's communications regarding your little extraction plan. The game is over before you even manage to reach the board." The remaining color drained from Julian's face. He stepped back, hitting the side of his sedan, trapped between the concrete and the terrifying reality of the man standing before him. "Now," Arthur continued, his voice devoid of any emotion, "you have a choice. In my left hand, I hold the evidence of your complicity in the attempted theft of my financial assets, a crime that will result in your immediate arrest by Swiss authorities, the revocation of your British citizenship, and a very public, humiliating trial that will destroy your family." Julian was shaking visibly now. And in your right hand." Arthur smiled, a chilling, predator's expression. He pulled a second document from the envelope. "In my right hand, I hold a fully authorized, expedited transfer order. A sudden, highly prestigious assignment as the lead cultural liaison to a remote, deeply unstable province in Central Asia. It includes a substantial hardship bonus and an immediate flight out of Geneva at noon today. You will never contact my wife again. You will not board the flight to Monaco. You will simply vanish." The silence in the garage stretched, broken only by the hum of the lights and Julian's ragged breathing. He looked at the senior diplomat, a man who possessed the power to crush him like an insect without ever raising his voice. The romantic illusion of running away with the beautiful wife of a powerful man shattered against the brutal, geopolitical reality of Arthur Beaumont. "Central Asia," Julian whispered, his voice broken. "Sign the transfer, Julian," Arthur commanded, offering him a sleek silver pen. "And I will make the audit disappear. You have 30 seconds before I contact the federal police." Julian took the pen with trembling hands and hastily scrawled his signature across the bottom of the UN transfer order. He did not look at Arthur. He simply handed the document back, a defeated, hollow man. "Your flight leaves in 6 hours," Arthur said, securing the paperwork in his coat. "Do not miss it." He turned and walked back toward his Mercedes, leaving the ruined attaché in the harsh fluorescent light. Arthur slid into the driver's seat, closing the heavy, armored door with a satisfying thud. He placed his hands on the steering wheel, staring at the empty space where his rage used to be, now replaced by a cold, terrifying satisfaction. The board was nearly clear. Diplomacy is the art of telling someone to go to hell in such a way that they ask for directions, Arthur murmured to the empty car. You just arrived at your destination, Karina. Friday morning at the penthouse was a study in profound, horrifying normalcy. The sun climbed high over Lake Geneva, casting long, elegant shadows across the hardwood floors of their bedroom. It was 10 a.m., 6 hours until the final transfer. Arthur sat in a wingback chair near the window, a cup of black coffee cooling in his hand, a copy of Le Temps open on his lap. He was not reading the geopolitical analysis of the summit. He was reading the subtle, frantic language of his wife's movements. Karina was packing a medium-sized Louis Vuitton weekender bag. She moved with a practiced, casual efficiency, her expression a perfect mask of mild annoyance. She folded a silk blouse, her movements precise and unhurried, as if this were merely another routine trip to Paris for the translation directorate. The German chancellor requested an emergency addendum to the trade agreement, Karina said, not looking up from her bag. Her voice was smooth, carrying the exact cadence of professional exasperation. I have to take the 2 p.m. train to Bern to finalize the nuances with the drafting committee. I am so sorry to leave you alone on the final day of the summit, Arthur. Arthur turned a page of his newspaper, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He took a slow sip of his coffee. The lie was so smooth, so effortlessly delivered, that it physically repulsed him. She was not going to Bern. She was going to the private airstrip outside the city limits, meeting Julian, and flying to Monaco. The German chancellor is notoriously demanding, Arthur replied, his voice a soothing, empathetic baritone. It is unfortunate, darling, but duty calls. Will you be returning on Sunday? Karina paused, her hand resting briefly on a pair of emerald earrings, the very earrings he had bought her for their 5th anniversary. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing them delicately into a small velvet pouch and zipping it into the bag. Yes, Sunday evening, just in time for the closing gala, she lied, finally turning to look at him. She offered him a soft, apologetic smile that did not quite reach her eyes. I will miss you. Arthur smiled back, the cold, predatory curve returning to his lips, though she was too preoccupied to notice the subtle shift. And I will miss you, Karina. Have a safe journey. He watched her zip the weekender shut. Every action she took was a nail in the coffin of their marriage, and he was the one holding the hammer. She was entirely oblivious to the fact that her lover was currently sitting on a commercial flight bound for Central Asia, frantically attempting to memorize the diplomatic protocols of a country he had never visited. She was unaware that the financial architecture she had painstakingly constructed over the last 14 months had been silently rewired to plunge into a legal black hole at exactly 1600 hours. Karina walked over to him, leaning down to press a kiss to his cheek. The scent of jasmine and adrenaline wafted over him. He did not pull away. He accepted the Judas kiss with the absolute stillness of a marble statue. I love you, Arthur, she murmured, pulling back and looking into his eyes one final time. It was a terrifying performance, a seamless blend of affection and total betrayal. I know, Arthur said simply, his voice devoid of any inflection. She turned and grabbed the handles of her bag, her heels clicking rapidly against the hardwood as she walked toward the front door. The sound faded down the hallway, followed by the heavy, decisive thud of the door closing. Arthur remained in the wingback chair, his coffee long forgotten. He listened to the silence of the empty penthouse, the space where his life had once existed. He checked his watch. It was 11:30 a.m. The countdown had officially begun. He stood up, smoothing the front of his trousers, and walked toward his private study. It was time to watch the empire fall. The private terminal at Geneva Airport was a sterile, hushed sanctuary for the ultra-wealthy, far removed from the chaotic hum of the commercial concourses. At 3:45 p.m. on Friday, Karina Beaumont sat on a white leather sofa, her Louis Vuitton weekender resting precisely by her feet. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, a sleek Embraer Phenom 300 idled on the tarmac, its engines whining softly, waiting to carry her to a new life in Monaco. She checked her gold Cartier watch. The delicate hands swept toward 4 p.m. The final, irreversible transfer of Arthur's wealth to the Zurich account was minutes away. She took a slow, deep breath, smoothing the skirt of her tailored travel suit. The adrenaline that had propelled her through the morning was beginning to curdle into a strange, hollow anxiety. Julian was late. He was supposed to meet her at the VIP lounge at 3:30 p.m. She pulled her secure tablet from her handbag, her manicured thumb hovering over the encrypted messaging app. She had sent him 3 messages in the last hour. None had been delivered. "Pardon me, Madame Beaumont," a voice murmured softly. Karina looked up to see the terminal concierge, a man whose entire career was built on discretion and anticipating the needs of diplomats. However, his expression was not deferential. It was strained, carrying the distinct discomfort of delivering very bad news to a very important person. "Yes, what is it?" Karina asked, her voice tight with suppressed panic. "I apologize for the intrusion, madam, but there appears to be a complication with your travel clearance," the concierge said, holding a slim, gray tablet. "A sudden, high-level security flag was placed on your diplomatic passport 20 minutes ago. The automated system has temporarily revoked your exit visa. We cannot authorize you to board the aircraft." Karina stared at him, the words struggling to process through the mounting dread in her chest. "A security flag? That is impossible. I am a senior translator for the American delegation. There must be a glitch in the UN database." "I am afraid it is not a UN flag, madam. It was issued directly by the Intelligence Directorate of the U.S. Embassy." The concierge lowered his voice, glancing nervously around the empty lounge. "Furthermore, the pilot has just informed us that the charter fee for the flight, which was to be paid upon departure, was declined by your primary banking institution." The air in the terminal suddenly felt too thin to breathe. The cold reality of Arthur's world, the world of back channels, sudden audits, and institutional power, began to bleed into her perfect, private escape plan. She snatched her tablet from her bag, bypassing the encrypted messages entirely, and logged directly into the secure portal of the Luxembourg holding account. It was 4:01 p.m. The final transfer should have executed. The screen loaded, displaying a single, terrifying line of text in stark red letters. "Transaction pending. Custodial hold initiated by primary account holder, A. Beaumont. Funds diverted to irrevocable trust." Karina's breath hitched in her throat. She tapped the screen frantically, trying to access the secondary Zurich account. It was frozen. She tried her personal checking account. Frozen. She tried the credit card linked to the Shell Corporation in the Cayman Islands. Access denied. Arthur knew. He didn't just know about the affair. He knew about the money. He knew everything. And he had waited until the exact moment she believed she was free to slam the cage door shut. "Madame Beaumont," the concierge asked, stepping back slightly, alarmed by the sudden, physical collapse of the woman before him. "Shall I contact the embassy on your behalf to resolve the security flag?" Karina looked up at the Emperor jet on the tarmac. It was no longer a vessel of escape. It was a monument to her spectacular failure. She was stranded in a private terminal with no money, no passport, and a lover who had vanished entirely from the face of the earth. "No," Karina whispered, her voice a fragile, shattered sound. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Julian had not simply missed the flight. Arthur had gotten to him. Arthur had dismantled her entire life with the clinical precision of a geopolitical strike. "Do not contact the embassy." She stood up, her legs trembling slightly, and picked up her weekender bag. It felt impossibly heavy now. She had nowhere to go but back to the penthouse. She had to face the monster she had awakened. The penthouse was suffocatingly quiet when Karina keyed the lock at 6:30 p.m. The sun had dipped below the Jura Mountains, casting the expansive living room into deep, violet shadows. She moved through the foyer like a ghost, her Louis Vuitton weekender dropping from her hand to land with a dull, heavy thud on the marble floor. She walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, her breathing shallow and ragged. She expected rage. She expected screaming. She expected the violent shattering of glass and the terrifying roar of a betrayed husband. Instead, she found Arthur sitting in the wingback chair, exactly where she had left him that morning. He was bathed in the dim light of a single reading lamp, an untouched glass of scotch resting on the side table. He did not look angry. He looked entirely, terrifyingly serene. "You missed your train to Bern, Karina," Arthur said, his voice a smooth, conversational baritone that cut through the silence like a scalpel. Karina froze, her hands trembling violently. She turned to face him, the final vestiges of her diplomatic composure disintegrating. "Where is he, Arthur? Where is Julian?" Arthur picked up his scotch, swirling the amber liquid slowly. "Julian Vane is currently somewhere over the Caspian Sea, en route to a sudden, highly classified cultural assignment in a province that does not possess reliable internet access. He seemed incredibly eager to accept the post this morning, once I clarified the alternatives." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. She staggered backward, hitting the edge of the dining table. You knew. For how long?" "Since Wednesday evening," Arthur replied, his voice devoid of any emotion. He set the glass down and stood up, moving toward her with the slow, measured grace of an apex predator. "A misrouted cable, Karina. A foolish, amateurish error by a woman who spent 14 months orchestrating a masterful financial embezzlement." He stopped a few feet away from her, his presence dominating the room. The air felt heavy, saturated with the toxic reality of their destroyed marriage. "You froze the accounts," Karina whispered, her voice cracking. Tears of pure, unadulterated panic finally spilled over her lashes. "You locked the Zurich transfer." "I did not freeze them, Karina. I redirected them." Arthur corrected her coldly. "Every cent you attempted to steal from me is now permanently locked in an irrevocable family trust. A trust that requires my biometric signature and a physical key to access. You are officially penniless. Your diplomatic passport has been flagged by embassy security. You cannot leave the country, and you cannot access the funds required to survive if you do." Karina stared at the man she had lived with for 7 years. She thought she had married a brilliant, predictable diplomat, a man she could easily outmaneuver. Instead, she was looking at a ruthless intelligence operative who had systematically dismantled her entire existence in less than 48 hours, without ever raising his voice. "Why?" she sobbed, finally breaking down completely. She sank to her knees on the hardwood floor, the flawless facade of the perfect wife shattering into jagged, pathetic pieces. "Why not just confront me? Why play this sick game?" Arthur looked down at her, his expression an impenetrable mask of bureaucratic authority. "Because, Karina, you did not simply break your vows. You attempted to destroy my life's work. You sat across from me at dinner parties and smiled, while silently robbing me blind to fund a life with a mid-level attaché. A simple divorce would have been a tactical failure. I needed you to understand the absolute magnitude of your mistake." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy silver key, the physical key to the irrevocable trust. He held it up to the dim light, a symbol of his absolute victory and her complete annihilation. "You played a game of geopolitics with our marriage, Karina," Arthur said softly, the words dripping with a chilling finality. "And you lost." The silence in the penthouse was no longer the quiet of a shared life, but the suffocating stillness of a tomb. Karina remained on the floor, her tears leaving dark, jagged streaks on the polished hardwood. She was utterly broken, a masterful translator who had suddenly lost all ability to communicate, let alone negotiate. She looked up at Arthur, a desperate, hollow plea in her eyes. "Arthur, please," she whispered, her voice barely a rasp. "We have been married for 7 years. I can explain. It was not just the money. I felt suffocated. I felt invisible next to you." Arthur looked down at her, his expression entirely devoid of pity or rage. He did not feel the familiar, comforting weight of love, nor did he feel the sharp, agonizing bite of betrayal anymore. He felt nothing. The cold, mechanical process of his revenge had excised the humanity from the situation entirely. "Visibility is a dangerous thing, Karina," Arthur said softly, his voice echoing slightly in the vast, empty room. You sought visibility with Julian Vane, and now you have the absolute attention of the diplomatic security apparatus and the Swiss banking authorities. You are no longer invisible. You are merely insignificant. He turned away from her, walking deliberately toward the entryway where her Louis Vuitton weekender still lay abandoned on the marble floor. He did not kick it. He did not throw it. He simply stepped around it with the detached precision of a man avoiding a piece of discarded trash. You have until Monday morning to vacate this penthouse, Arthur stated, his back to her. He pulled his overcoat from the closet, sliding his arms into the sleeves with practiced efficiency. The embassy will arrange a commercial flight back to Washington, D.C. for you. A standard, economy class ticket. Your diplomatic credentials have been permanently revoked. When you land, my attorneys will serve you with divorce papers citing gross financial misconduct and infidelity. You are leaving me with nothing? Karina choked out, the reality of her total destruction finally solidifying in her mind. I have no money, Arthur. I have no career. You destroyed Julian. Arthur paused, his hand resting on the heavy brass handle of the front door. He turned back to look at her one final time. She was a beautiful, ruined thing kneeling in the shadows of the life she had tried to steal. You left yourself with nothing, Karina. Arthur corrected her, his voice perfectly level. I merely accelerated the timeline. He reached his left hand across his body, his fingers finding the heavy gold band on his ring finger. With a slow, deliberate motion, he slid the ring over his knuckle. The metal felt strange and cold as it detached from his skin after 7 years. He walked slowly to the small, mahogany console table near the door. He placed the gold ring precisely in the center of the polished wood. The soft clink of the metal against the table sounded like a gunshot in the silent penthouse. He looked at the ring, a symbol of a promise that had been hollowed out by greed and dismantled by a cold, terrifying vengeance. He had won the war. He had secured his wealth, his position, and his pride. But as he looked at the wreckage of the woman he had once loved, he realized the victory had cost him the very capacity to trust. He was entirely intact and entirely alone. Arthur opened the heavy front door, the cool air of the hallway rushing into the stagnant heat of the penthouse. Diplomacy is the art of telling someone to go to hell in such a way that they ask for directions, Arthur Beaumont said softly, his voice a chilling epitaph for their marriage. You just arrived at your destination, Karina. He stepped out into the hallway and pulled the door shut behind him, the heavy latch engaging with a solid, definitive click.